In 1837, Chicago got its city status. In 1840, its population reached a limit of 4,000 people, and it occupied a distinguished geographic location between east and west of the United States. Chicago quickly became one of the main transport hubs in the country, which in return caused a huge rise in the city's production and a fast growth of population. Chicago is located on the shores of Michigan Lake, which is a lowland flood-prone terrain. After spring floods and heavy rains, there was a lot of mud left on the streets of Chicago. I wonder how horses could move around the mud-strewn city without going through one of these dirt roads. These roads were so risky that it was called the swamp where every hope is lost. In such places, some usual jovial plates with inscriptions saying "No bottom here" were placed till the middle of the 19th century. Many have called Chicago the dirtiest city in America, where poor sanitary conditions led to the spread of repeated epidemics such as typhoid and dysentery. This caused great damage to the city, and in 1854, a cholera epidemic wiped out 66% of the city's population, forcing the local authorities to deal decisively with the issue of establishing an urban sewage system. In 1856, the United States City Councils approved for the first time on a construction plan for the city sewers. Generally, we can see that it's a regular history of an American city. They founded the city in a swamp, and it didn't bother them. But here by chance, after 20 years, they came back to their senses and noticed that they still have the dirtiest city in the whole of America, where horses were covered to their bellies with dirt, and for some reason, people started getting afflicted with many diseases. Most importantly, the city was already built about 20 years before, and they forgot to build the city's sewage system. So, the city's council appointed Ellis Chesbrough to design the new sewage system. From his engineering point of view, the main problem was the estuary from the sewage system of the city, which was impossible to get mixed with the drinking water of Michigan Lake. Chicago got their main source of water from Michigan Lake. Ellis Chesbrough made a brilliant plan from two parts, where they should start a sewerage system from above ground that gets buried afterwards by a thick layer of soil. Then they should raise the entire city's building height by 10 feet with the use of a complex leverage system. I think they planned it brilliantly. A city without sewerage systems, where they firstly laid pipes above the ground and then just raised the entire city's buildings using levers by 10 feet upwards. I think it's the best construction solution that nobody could ever beat, but that's not all. Some buildings were raised on spot, whilst levers from other additions were used to move buildings into different places as shown. Such a wonderful plan. Mainly, it was easy to implement within the 19th century as these levers had already been invented. Also, there were lots of horses that helped in transportation by simple and innovative means. In January 1858, Chicago was able to raise a single brick building of about 27 meters long and weighing 750 tons by using screw jacks. The house was raised to a height of 2 meters long without any of the slightest damage to the building. It was even written within newspapers. Moreover, that year they were able to raise another 50 large stone buildings, but for the process of elevating the buildings, it included Boston's most famous engineer, James Brown. His company became the first to take such productive events in that tremendous volume of lifting buildings within the city. In 1862, the confidence in their abilities was so high that the company was composed of only 6 engineers, including Brown, where they took upon themselves a highly responsible event of lifting the most important landmarks within the city, where they lifted them entirely in one swoop. This performance and notoriety provoked battles on the late block street from a huge number of shops, offices, printing presses, and similar buildings out of brick and stone of 4 to 5 stories high. Daily normal life took action during their work that didn't stop on the streets, where people came and went into buildings or shops and worked as if nothing unusual was happening. In 5 days, with the help of 600 workers using the same number of screw jacks, they were able to raise the block by 1.5 meters. By the next year, led by Eli, Smith and Pullman, they were even able to lift the Trentmont Hotel building. This building was built from brick stones of about 6 floors, where its base area had reached 4,000 meters squared. Again, everything continued to function properly, even when the huge building was torn off the ground. Furthermore, the guests of the hotel didn't even bother with their work. Close to the hotel street, 500 people worked on the hotel's pit, where they had to raise its height by almost 2 meters. Can you imagine how difficult it would be to lift a 6-story brick building by 2 whole meters within the 19th century? Not to mention, if an earthquake or fire occurred, that mostly all the brick buildings in American cities collapse into molds. Conclusively, the building was raised with the help of cranes without even a single crack, and even local residents couldn't notice what had been going on. Let's move on with our official history. Everyone was trying to move their buildings with a more interesting method. Lots of wooden frame buildings were transferred from the center of Chicago in the mid of the 19th century, where they were considered entirely inconvenient for a fast-growing and prosperous city. So, they spent most of their time lifting up buildings and moving them into another place to make room for new stone buildings to be constructed, where the old wooden multi-story buildings were moved to the city's outskirts, and sometimes entire blocks of buildings equipped with several objects and furniture were moved on a larger scale than what was perceived like a game of moving everything around. When the traveler David Macri visited Chicago, he wrote that there wasn't a single day while I was in the city where I didn't get to see one or even several houses leaving their neighborhoods. He also stated that from 3 to 9 buildings were moved out from Conkey into Madison Street. While riding his horse, he had to stop twice to let the houses cross the street. The work was carried out where nothing interfered with the daily routine of city life. Business shops were also open, offering their services where people had to get into them by climbing through their moving doors while the entire brick building was being moved down the street. At first, a 2.5-story building was moved a short distance from Madison Street to Monroe Street. But afterwards, stone buildings in Chicago began to be moved into much further distances. Everything had happened by the mid-19th century. People went racing with each other and easily moved their houses. Sometimes it sounds like science fiction writers worked as part-time historians in America. In the future, we'll get back to Chicago, where it has many more interesting topics to discuss.